أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحن نقص عليك نبأهم بالحق. إنهم فتية آمنوا بربهم وزدناهم هدى. وربطنا على قلوبهم إذ قاموا فقالوا ربنا رب السماوات والأرض لن ندعو من دونه إلها لقد قلنا إذا شططا. هؤلاء قومنا اتخذوا من دونه آلهة لولا يأتون عليهم بسلطان بين فمن أظلم ممن افترى على الله كذبا.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the first episode of Ilm Spark. My name is Sumaya and I'm an 11th grader at Legacy International Online High School.
And I'm also Sumaya and I'm a 12th grader at Legacy International Online High School. And today we are joined by a very, very special guest, Imam Tom, who is our amazing Islamic history and tafsir teacher at Legacy International Online High School, and also, mashallah, the new research director of Islamic Society at Yaqeen Institute.
Inshallah.
So, assalamu alaikum and welcome, Imam Tom. Jazakumullah khairan for joining us.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me on. It's an honor, and I'm very, very happy to see what you all will do with this platform.
Yes, inshallah. So Imam Tom will be joining Sumaya and I for a rich and thorough discussion in a bit, inshallah. So we're super, super excited to launch this new initiative, which we hope sparks fruitful discussion on relevant issues that affect youth in our present-day society, and maybe helps us gain a little bit of a different perspective and deepen our understanding of these issues.
Yeah, and as high schoolers, we thought what better way to start off Ilm Spark than with the enlightening topic of youth leadership and community involvement.
So rather than thinking about this from the perspective of the youth or from the perspective of the adults, we want to think about this more from a collective point of view and ask the question, what are we all doing together? So how do we learn from each other and work together to create these stronger and more vibrant communities? But to get to this point and to reach this ultimate goal of ours, we need to facilitate this healthy discourse. And we hope that having these rich discussions will help bridge that generational gap that exists between the Muslim youth and the adults in our communities, which is something they really excelled at in prophetic society. And so when we were brainstorming, one of the most striking and inspiring stories that we came across was the story of Mus'ab bin Umair radiallahu anhu, who was someone who had everything. He had wealth, he had looks, and he had status in society. And that combination of things led him to have many, many admirers. And so he was already a trendsetter before Islam. You know, people would describe his long flowy garments as, draping across the floor as he walked the city. Right. And so he had a lot going for him and a likable personality. But at some point in his life, he decided he was going to sacrifice all the blessings he was given to follow and pursue the path of the truth. So he started attending the lectures at Dar al-Arqam that the Rasul was giving. And he was very convinced by this message and decided to enter the fold of Islam. But while he was doing all of this, he was going against the wishes of his mother. He was defying societal norms of the time, which is something like, as young people living in the West, it is something that we can really relate to, right? Because we have this like strong tide pushing us in one direction. We have every fiber of our being telling us to go and follow that tide, go in that direction. But we have to look the other way. We have to take the less taken path, and we need to, step up, be the bigger people, and look towards the truth, right? And so, when we go out in public wearing hijab, when we pray in public, these are all times when we're going against, that tide that's pushing us, and we're being the bigger people. And so just as Mus'ab bin Umair was respected and admired before Islam, he was able to build that esteem in the eyes of the Prophet ﷺ after he entered Islam. And so, to the point that the Prophet ﷺ chose him as the ambassador to the people of Medina, right? So he was able to eloquently articulate the message to the people of Medina. And he was chosen, above many, many older Sahaba that the Prophet ﷺ could have chosen, but he chose Mus'ab. And Mus'ab brought many people into the folds of Islam through that, journey to Medina. And it was a very honorable position he was given by the Rasul ﷺ.
Yeah, and I think what's so significant about Mus'ab bin Umair's story, to me personally, is that he did all of these things, before the age of 32, because he died radiallahu anhu in the Battle of Uhud when he was 32. And so he was able to, take all these leadership roles before that age, that prime age. And sometimes we feel like society now is like, you graduate college and then you start thinking, what do I want to do? What do I want my legacy to be? Why am I here? And he shows us that you do that. You can actually do that earlier on, before that prime age. And I really love that about his story.
Yeah, and he's not even, mashallah, and he's not even the only person, the only example from prophetic society. We can look at many others like Usama bin Zayd radiallahu anhu, who was chosen over many older Sahaba by the Prophet ﷺ in his teens to lead an entire army of Muslims against their enemies. Even looking further back in time to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, he broke idols as a teen. He broke the idols of the pagans, and he stepped up. He took that initiative. He did something that he knew would have major consequences, but he did it because he was doing it for a bigger purpose, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, and also we can look at another Sahabi, Abdullah Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who was actually 13 years old when the Prophet ﷺ died. So, and he would watch the Prophet ﷺ throughout his whole childhood, and he had great knowledge, and he would go to these halaqas with elders, and they would always wonder, why is this kid here? He's not as experienced, he doesn't have as much knowledge as us, and they would underestimate him, and they were like, they would get to the point that they were jealous that their kids weren't there. And, we can relate to, I personally can relate to Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu story, where I'm a student. Sometimes I take college classes and people sometimes they underestimate me. They don't want to work with me. They're like, oh, who's this? Like, why is she here? She's gonna be a setback to our project, etc. And, it gets hard for youth who want to be, who want to take initiative they get crushed by society's pressure and underestimation of us. And it's something that we have to overcome if we want to make an impact in our community. And we can look at Abdullah ibn Abbas and see how he did it. He overcame that pressure by demonstrating by example that he was able to do these things, and he was able to be there, and he had the same capabilities that they did. And that's because he learned from them. He didn't just, he wasn't like magically get there. He learned, he watched, he observed, and mashallah, he was able to be there. And it's said that when Abdullah radiallahu anhu spoke, everyone would listen, and when someone spoke, he would listen. So he still had this great respect for them. He wasn't rude to them. And you can take from this that you have to go through tough situations if you want to be a leader. And you can see that Mus'ab and Abdullah radiallahu anhuma and Ibrahim alayhi salam all went through hardships, and they can show us how to work through these issues. And so if we've mustered up the courage to step into these roles, which people are initially hesitant of our capabilities, then we need to be mindful of the weight that they hold, and it can't be taken lightly, and you have to know what you're talking about. You can't just do anything, And I think there's two really important things about being a leader that I personally like. And the first is that when you're a leader, you're a role model. So people are watching you. You have to be on your best behavior, and you're an example. So you have to be careful in your actions. And the second thing is that a leader gives directions, but when something goes wrong, they still take responsibility and make people feel important. And with that being said, I also want to acknowledge the other side of leadership, where sometimes people don't have the personality to lead things. They're not always the face of the project. They're not, always there, but they still put as much work. And, those people are just as important. And, people should try to achieve things at an early age, but it's also, pressuring when people say, oh, it's, I'm 20 and I haven't done anything yet. And society makes us feel like, oh, we have to be CEOs by our late 20s and stuff like that. So I think the most important thing is that you have a mindset of challenging growth, and in a way that helps you figure out what your role in spreading Allah's message is. And I think that's the biggest thing in being a leader.
Yes, definitely. And in addition to that, I know we're talking a lot about leadership, but in reality, not everyone is going to be a leader. So in leadership theory, according to the first follower principle, the first followers are just as important as a leader, because what is a leader without his or her followers, right? So it takes that courage, that it's just as, you're just as courageous of a person to be that first person to follow someone who's doing the right thing, right? So we already know it's courageous to step up and be a leader in something, but it's just as courageous to go and say, okay, this person is doing the right thing, I will follow them. I will publicly, be a follower. I will take that role, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, as a leader, was strengthened by this first generation of courageous followers. Those people are the ones who really, like, in the beginning years gave him his momentum, allowed him to become what he became. So the likes of Khadija radiallahu anha, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Ali radiallahu anhu. And then, later on in time, many of these first followers of the Prophet ﷺ became leaders and had followers of their own. And so, just like putting that emphasis, that value on first followers as much as we do on leaders. And then also, in a different sense, we're always talking about youth leadership, but we don't put enough emphasis on youth followership. And that's just highlighting the importance of listening first and foremost to gain wisdom. So, attending those cross-generational gatherings where adults are there and, they're sharing their stories. They have, 4 to 5 decades of age, like they're 4 to 5 decades older than you, right? And so they're sharing their experiences from, those years of life that you are lacking, right? So just to sit there and listen before you speak so that you can absorb that wisdom and get to that point. So Abdullah bin Abbas, going back to his story, is an excellent example of that. When he attended gatherings of older Sahaba. And like Sumaya mentioned, when he spoke, everyone would listen. But the second half of this is also, when other people spoke, he would listen, right? And that's just as important, to put emphasis on listening to elders in our gatherings so that we can learn from them. And so on the note of someone who has more wisdom and experience about these issues, we have Imam Tom rejoining us, who, as mentioned, is our teacher at Legacy, as well as a new addition to the Yaqeen team, but also an established imam in his community, mashallah, and has worked with founding and directing several youth groups in the past. He has a unique teaching style, which is highly interactive and brings high-level concepts to a level that even children can understand. And he's passionate about building relationships with Muslim youth and giving them the tools and confidence they need to live as observant, well-adjusted people of faith in our times. So welcome, Imam Tom.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'll jump in with the first question. So I have thought about this a lot, and I want to leave a purpose and legacy behind. And I'm not sure how I can do that as a young person. So what are some thoughts or advice on how youth who want to be more involved in their communities can have an impact, and not just in the community service point of view, like the raking leaves in the soup kitchens?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, rasulillah. I think that the biggest thing that youth have to have when they're looking to get involved in community is patience. I think that high aspirations are a really important thing. I think what you said is really nice, that they shouldn't just think about soup kitchens and handing out silverware and these sorts of things. They should dream about being on the board someday, or starting a program and running it themselves. There's a lot of different important ways that youth can contribute to a community. However, the biggest thing that you're going to have in order to make that a reality is patience, because people aren't going to trust you right away. Leadership is all about building relationships, and people will believe in you before they believe in your vision. So you need to cultivate relationships. You can't just have, it's like, that's what happens usually. We're young and we're idealistic, and we think up the best program, and it's going to have this and it's going to have that. And we assume that all we have to do is communicate our vision to whoever has the keys or the bank card or whatever it is to make it happen. And then we get disappointed when they don't empower us, hand the keys over or whatever. Well, we've forgotten something really important from that equation, and that's trust. And trust comes from building relationships. Those have nothing to do with your vision, has nothing to do with your intelligence. So if they don't know who you are, they're not going to trust you to do anything. And that doesn't remove blame from some people who maybe should be more trusting, but it's just the reality of the situation, is that you're going to have to realize that stepping into community life is about stepping into relationships and trying to build up relationships that one day you're going to be able to leverage them into empowerment and change and impact and community building.
Yeah, I do. That's so important to highlight, because I've actually seen that firsthand in our community as well. When people, new people will come in and they'll have all these amazing ideas that they want to propose right away and they want to see happen, come into fruition, but they always, you forget sometimes that there are already existing networks. There's a system that you have to go through, and like you said, you have to build that trust and prove yourself before, people will hand over the keys, like you said. So all of that. Thank you.
And I also have a question about the other extreme. I have some friends, or I know some people that they're not interested in becoming involved in the masjid. How can, we pull those people in? What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, everybody has to have urgency, and you have to have urgency in the sense that your life is going to end, and you're going to die, and you're going to not have any more opportunities to do anything. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, you don't want to be left in a place of regret. You don't want to be like, oh, I should have done this, or I wish I had done that. If I could go back again, then I would get more involved, or this, whatever. Right? You have to realize that you've only got this really brief opportunity, and you need to make the most of it. And the second thing is that you need to eliminate distractions, right? Because, and I really sympathize with your generation because you got more distractions than ever, right? You mentioned the legacy in the beginning. Most people aren't thinking about their legacy at your age. They're thinking about how many likes they're going to get on their IG post or their reel or whatever, or they're trying to portray this type of persona, develop a following, whatever it is that they think that they're doing. And I'm not going to say that that's never useful for dawah or anything like that, but definitely the vast majority of it is pretty useless. And a distraction from leaving a real legacy. If you run one program in a masjid, like let's take, for example, like a read aloud for kids, for kids between the ages of 3 and 6, you're going to read them stories once a week. Like if you do that for 2 months, I bet you'll be remembered for years, if not decades, by those kids who had that experience. And if you put, you put 5 years, even 10 years into a social media platform, whether it's TikTok, whether it's IG or whatever, if you pass away, you will be forgotten within months. You'll be forgotten within months. Like nobody, it's going to move on. Like there's going to be somebody else, taking up your attention. So if you want to talk about a legacy, something that matters, and that's why it's a distraction, because it pulls in our attention, it pulls in our intellectual sort of labor and all these sorts of things, our concern, right? Our mental and emotional energy gets put into these things that really are just going to evaporate. It's like building, sandcastles right near the incoming waves. Whereas if we just kind of walked away from the beach a little bit and we started, playing with bricks, then we would actually build something that would last.
MashaAllah, I really love that analogy. It's cool.
Yeah, and that ties kind of into my next question, which is about generational tension. And so we kind of know, every generation thinks the next generation is better off or is more spoiled than they were. And so like our question to you is, how can we combat this generational tension? How do we get past this like mentality that, not to play down the struggles of the past generation, but those struggles maybe were more physical, and we're facing mental struggles, like you mentioned, with social media and all these distractions present today. So like, why do people have such a bad rap with the older generation, and how do we get past that and move on to like identifying those struggles instead?
Yeah, that's the thing I think a lot about. And my kind of thoughts on this continue to develop and change. I mean, I think that one thing that we actually covered in class today was how we saw how Dutch colonialism in the Indonesian archipelago basically set up the older generation to be like completely useless, within a very short amount of time, right? And we can't underestimate the way in which that works on us, even in North America, right? It's like the knowledge and experience and the types of knowledge that our grandparents have is not going to always be the most useful to us. And that's going to be the source of a big disconnect. I think that where does the youth get over it? I mean, I think that if the youth adopts the attitude and the mentality of not seeking validation necessarily from the older generations, but seeking to almost take on like a caregiver's perspective, right? It's like, think about if you were in their situation. Think about if you had all this knowledge, all this experience, all this whatever, and like basically society's telling you that you should just go live by yourself in an old folks home, and that nobody really, has a lot to learn from you anymore. It's a very demoralizing sort of role to play in our society. And so the youth, I think, they get frustrated because usually the funds and the power, so to speak, is in the hands of people who are older than them, and there's tension there. But in a certain sort of way, older people need to be cared for, like in a really interesting way, right? It's like their pride's been kind of taken away, or they're almost like victims. You know what I mean? And I think if from a youth perspective, you almost approach it like that. Don't tell the parents because maybe they'll be offended by that. But like, you approach, if you have like your grandmother or your grandfather who like can't feed himself and you're helping like whatever, it doesn't make sense to get upset at them if they have some sort of old-fashioned ideas or whatever. we almost make a mistake when, like, the youth, we treat our parents and our grandparents as if we're talking to people our age. And so it's the same thing again. It's like you want to convince them, you want to argue with them, you want to be like, no, you need to recognize me. You need to recognize what I'm trying to tell you. You need to recognize that my way is the right way. That's like the wrong avenue, right? It's like you think that you have something. Maybe you do. Maybe you have like the best idea ever, but you don't need validation from other people, right? You kind of just like believe in yourself and believe in what you bring to the table, and try to again develop those relationships and maneuver and put yourself in a position where someday you're going to be able to leverage it into real change, and just kind of take on like a caregiver's perspective. It's like, these people, that are of the older generation, they have needs too, and they need to feel heard. I think that's the big thing. People say in like relationship counseling, right? That's like if two spouses are fighting, 9 times out of 10, each side is most frustrated, not by not getting their way, but by feeling that they're not heard, right? I think a lot of time in our youthful kind of like passion and zeal, we don't let our older generation feel heard, which makes it harder for us to get what we want in the end anyway, right? It's like sometimes I think that we just need to, again, be caring and make them feel heard, and then keep on doing things that we think are right anyway. And inshallah, hopefully that'll help.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the story of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. He was capable of being in those meetings with them, but he never downgraded them. He never said, "Oh, like I could be here," but he proved that he could, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's also similar to that situation because the other, most of the adults didn't get it, and it was Umar who was like, "Look, he belongs," right? So why should we have any expectations that are different than that? 9 out of 10 adults are going to think that you don't belong, that you're a kid, your opinion doesn't matter, you don't have enough experience. But somewhere in the community, there's an Umar who gets it and who's going to see it's like, hey, this thing that they're passionate about, it actually has a lot of value. So maybe that's another thing, that within your own communities, you got to try to find your Umar, and like who's going to be an advocate for the youth and who's going to try to empower them.
Yeah. Sure. Okay, so this next question is kind of personal to me, but I think that there are some people that can, gain from it. So I coach a Muslim girls soccer team, and I can tell by the way that some of them come ask me things that are not involving soccer, that I have some sort of like influence or role model like nature with them. And so in what ways do I have to be prepared to lead them and others, because I feel like it's an amana, like they're looking up to me. What do I have to like be prepared with to when they're watching me?
I mean, the first thing is like acknowledging your leadership position, right? You get a lot of people that they get a following and they never intended to get a following, and then their response is, "Well, I'm not a role model, I'm not a leader, like whatever, don't follow me." Well, it's like tough luck, It's like people are following you, so it's a thing that you have to accept as, okay, maybe you didn't want it, but Allah gave it to you, and now you are burdened with it, and you have to make the best of it. And once you accept it, I think a lot of it, and you indicated this in how you formulated the question, it has to do with your example. You have to be prepared that people are going to take your example and say, well, I saw Sumaya do it, and so that means it's okay. And that's kind of scary, but it's really important. It's really important, like people are looking at you in a different way. And that can be empowering and a good thing, because maybe they have an overly narrow sort of idea about what someone like you should be doing. It's right. And then so when you go and do something, it's like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that I could do this too. That, for example, like a practicing Muslim woman can coach a soccer team, right? It's like, well, now you're training other leaders to be in that sort of way. But it's also it's a double-edged sword, because if you slack off in one particular area, let's say like you miss a prayer, or you're with some of your soccer teammates, and time for prayer comes in, and you're just like, well, I'm just going to wait until I get home or whatever, or forget about breaking fast, these sorts of things. They're going to take that cue from you. They're going to learn your priorities, and then they're going to internalize them and think that that's okay. So it's kind of scary. It's a tremendous responsibility, but you have to try to think about are my decisions going to impact how other people are going to make decisions going forward.
Yeah. Definitely a lot of pressure there in those roles. And I have another addition to make as well, is just like as part of the youth council in my community, the first thing they told us going in was that basically leadership equals sacrifice. So you're no longer here to have fun, right? So your role now, you've ascended, quote unquote, and now you have more power, quote unquote. But now you're here to engage people. So you're going to be that person that goes up to the person that's not participating or not talking to anyone, who's standing on the side alone, and you're going to ask them their name. You're going to get to know them, because once you make yourself interested in others, they become more interested in you. And so again, just leadership equals sacrifice. So you're sacrificing your own entertainment, your fun, and also just being aware of that pressure that once you step into those roles. All right, so moving on to the next question we have for you. We see that there are a lot of young adults that, once they enter the college sphere, they detach themselves from their communities. And that might be because of intense study schedules or for other reasons. So can you speak a little bit about that transition between high school and college?
Yeah, that's a super important question. And I think there's a couple things. One factor is, where do you go to college? Okay. If you go far away from home, I think it lends itself to that attitude of, well, I'm only here for 4 years. The shaitan gets so many people with that. It's like, well, why? It's like a revolving door or whatever. It doesn't affect everybody. I've seen some people who they know they only have 4 years in a particular place, but yet they apply themselves and they do really well. But most people, it's just too tempting to be like, well, I'm not going to build anything really long term, and I'm not going to see the fruits of it. And so why bother? When we're thinking about how to select a college, is usually very, very selective. Like we're only thinking about the quality of the school, really, or the quality of the program and how it's going to. We only have professional concerns. Okay, we don't have spiritual concerns. We don't have and this is a really interesting thought experiment. Like, what if you had two universities that were similar, when it comes to cost and programs or whatever, but one would enable you to commute and be in your same Muslim community that you've been in growing up, versus one that's going to take you away for 4 years and sever that connection, right? Which one would you choose? So I think that in general, we have to introduce priorities and criteria that are not just professional into the equation. What's going to be best for your soul? What's going to be best to your, to your afterlife? And what's going to be best for even your community involvement? That should be there just as much as your professional career and stuff like that. There's also the thing, if you're going residential and you're not a commuter, college is a very isolating experience, especially if this is your first time living away from home for a long period of time. So if a lot of people get homesick, so if you're combining that factor with not having an MSA, with a very liberal sort of atmosphere, right? I'm not saying that applies to either one of your situations exactly, but just as a thought experiment, that's a recipe for disaster, right? Whereas, so I'm just saying that, and I hope the parents are listening to this, that all these factors have to be considered. It's there's your child's emotional health, right? You have to realize that this is their first time. It's not just about, they get a little homesick. No, this affects decision making. Are you going to go to a party or not if you're invited to a party? Well, if I'm feeling super homesick and I feel like I don't have any friends, and somebody invites me out to a party, maybe I'm more likely to accept that invitation if I'm in an emotionally compromised state, right? Compared to if I happen to go to a school with a good support group, an MSA, some people that maybe even come from my same community, then I'm already going to hit the ground running with a social support network that's already kind of on this Islamic vibe, and I'm going to be way more resilient when it comes to resisting the sort of temptations that are part of normal college life.
So our next question is, every local Muslim community is filled with different opinions on different issues. And being a young person in a community, how can we navigate the circulation of ideas and exhibit patience in dealing with these diverse opinions?
9 times out of 10, I think that's probably not going to be your concern, to be honest with you. But I do think that it shows that, and this goes back to the intergenerational question, finding a mentor is really, really important. One of the problems of how colleges and universities are set up currently is that it's very artificial, right? You're taking everybody from between 18 to 22 years and you're making them live by themselves and study something, right? It's like that's not how natural human societies operate, right? In natural human societies, they have kids, they have elderly, they have people in their middle ages, right? You don't have just like, every age group stratified and cordoned off by itself. And so it's difficult, but if you can try to find some sort of mentor figure, somebody who you would like to be like, at least in one respect, it could be professionally, it could be spiritually, it could be like whatever, and you attach yourself to them and try to benefit from them, that's the kind of person that you would need to refer to when we're dealing with issues of diversity within the community. Because to be frank, it's like if you haven't studied like Islam in a super rigorous way and you're not aware of the differences of opinion and stuff like that, it's best not to really wade into that territory in the first place, because you're going to mess up, right? You're going to think that some things are okay that's not okay, and you're going to think that some things are not okay that are actually fine, right? And so it's kind of just asking for trouble, right? And many scholars of the past in our classical tradition said that, if you haven't studied the differences of opinion, then you haven't studied fiqh, right? And so this is something that's kind of like expertise. It's kind of like, it's not like common knowledge. So for the most part, you should look, that's not your fight, right? That's the fight, that's somebody else's fight. There might be, if you do have a mentor, and if you do have somebody who's a scholarly figure who can kind of give voice to that, then your job is kind of like a facilitator. So you might be more aware socially of some of the social dynamics in your community where somebody's feeling salty about a certain opinion being followed and not theirs, right? Or the way that they pray witr, or the way that they do this in the masjid, or gender segregation, or whatever it is, right? And because the imam or the mentor that you have doesn't have direct access to that person, you might have a role when it comes to trying to funnel that person into like the gravital sphere of the mentor or of the imam or of the scholar or something like that, so that they can actually get some guidance on the issue.
Very cool. So basically just delegate, or know where what your position is, and kind of leave it to the people with more knowledge to take care of those situations. Makes sense. Alrighty, that was our final question for you, Imam Tom. So any final thoughts or advice you'd like to leave us with?
Just one last thing, and I think that you hit on it and you said it earlier, Sumaya. I'm just going to repackage it. Is that leadership is not about finishing the race first, right? It's not about being in the front. Leadership is about making sure everybody finishes the race together, and that requires you to be a motivator. It requires you to take interest in other people, like you said. The last couple of years, I've started studying leadership, and I hadn't before that, and it's really been an eye-opener. Just a lot of things that I was doing wrong, like how to have relationships with people. Like you said, it's sacrifice. You're not relating to people, as a friend or by yourself. You're relating to them as a leader.
So Jazakumullah khairan, Imam Tom, for taking the time out to participate in our discussion and share gems with us. And that brings our podcast to a conclusion. Thank you for listening to the first episode of Ilm Spark, brought to you by Sumaya Squared. Yours truly. And we will see you guys next time. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.